Retired cowboy bought Apache girls to free them, but ended up marrying them instead.
Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The afternoon heat in sagebrush crossing lingered in a dry, unmoving sheet across the ground, and the dust around the trading yard rose in thin spirals each time a wagon wheeled past over hard-packed earth. The place carried its usual noise: men haggling over cattle, merchants shouting prices, horses shifting restlessly at the rails. But beneath everything was a sour tension Harlan Boone noticed the moment he stepped down from his horse. He pulled his coat straight, adjusted the strap of his saddlebag, and scanned the yard the way he'd learned during years of escorting supply caravans and working long cattle drives. He didn't trust crowded spaces anymore, not since he lost his younger brother in a raid 10 years earlier, and the memory of that night still made him cautious whenever men gathered too closely. Harlan had come to town for practical reasons only. He needed new hinges for the barn door, a sack of salt, a tool handle to replace the one he cracked last week, and enough flour to last through the coming month. His homestead lay far from the main trail, built against the dry canyon wall where few people traveled, and he liked it that way. Solitude kept things predictable. No one asked questions. No one tried to pry into the years he spent drifting after the raid that took the boy he raised like a son. He walked toward the trading post with slow, deliberate steps, but an unusual crowd near the far end of the yard caught his eye. Men stood shoulder to shoulder, some leaning over the rail, others pushing forward for a better look. Their voices didn't match the usual bargaining tone. Instead, there were short bursts of laughter, sharp calls, and the sound of a wooden stick striking against the platform. Harlan's stomach knotted. He recognized the rhythm of something he had seen before on the trail, something involving people who couldn't defend themselves. He angled his steps toward the commotion, his boots scraping lightly through loose dirt. With each stride, his breath tightened a little more. He wanted to believe it was just another livestock trade, but the longer he listened, the harder it became to ignore a sense of dread building in his chest. His heartbeat thudded in a steady, controlled rhythm, the same way it did before gunfire broke out on long escort rides. When he reached the platform, he stopped so abruptly that a man behind him muttered under his breath. 3 Apache girls stood on the boards with their wrists tied by thin rope. The restraint looked lazy, as if the men who captured them hadn't bothered to secure it because they expected the girls to be too exhausted to resist. The oldest held herself upright despite shaking arms. Her long black hair hung in stiff, tangled strands that pointed to days of rough travel. The middle girl stayed pressed to her side, breathing in short, unsteady pulls as she watched the men below. The youngest hid behind both of them, her thin shoulders jerking each time someone in the crowd shouted. A man wearing a red scarf tapped the rail again with a stick. 3 workers, he called out, taken from a camp east of the ridge. Good for chores. Strong enough if you know how to handle them. Harlan felt something shift inside him with painful clarity. He had seen enough raids in his life to know what these girls had gone through before arriving here. His mind flicked to the image of his brother, lying on the ground, breath slowing, chest torn open, and the helplessness that had swallowed him as he tried to stop the bleeding. He had carried that moment for a decade, and facing these 3 frightened girls brought the old guilt back with startling force. He noticed details no one else seemed to care about. The oldest girl's stance was defensive, not submissive. She kept her chin lifted even though her voice trembled when she whispered something to the girl beside her. The middle one blinked rapidly, a sign of someone trying not to panic in front of strangers. The youngest bare feet were scraped along the tops, showing she had been pushed or dragged at some point. Harlan swallowed hard. He felt anger rising, not loud or explosive, but steady and cold. His breath grew shallower, and he clenched his jaw to keep himself steady. He didn't want to make a scene. He didn't want to start trouble he couldn't finish. But he also couldn't walk away. The thought of leaving them there made his chest tighten in a way he hadn't felt since the night he buried his brother. The scarf man shouted the first price. Before anyone else spoke, Harlan stepped forward. "I'll pay it," he said in a quiet, controlled tone. No hesitation, No bargaining. He reached into his coat and pulled out the money he'd been saving for winter repairs. His hand shook slightly, not from fear, but from a burst of adrenaline he kept carefully contained. The scarfed man stared at him. For all three. Yes. Cash. Harlan placed the bills into the man's palm without counting. He didn't care about the amount anymore. He just wanted the noise around the girls to stop. The man flipped through the stack, satisfied, and shoved the rope toward him. Harlan didn't touch it. Instead, he drew his knife, cut the rope cleanly, and let it drop to the floorboards. The sudden stillness in the crowd washed over them like a brief pause before a storm. Men murmured, some irritated, others surprised at how quickly the sale had ended. Harlan ignored them all. He turned to the girls, speaking evenly so they could hear the meaning in his words, even if they didn't catch every syllable. "You're coming with me. You're safe now." The oldest stared at him, studying his face the same way she would study a threat. She looked for something hidden, something dangerous, something familiar to the men who had dragged her here. She found nothing but a tired man holding steady under his own weight. The middle girl clung to her arm. The youngest blinked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. Harlan didn't touch any of them. He simply walked toward the wagon he had left near the trough, making sure his pace was slow enough that they could choose to follow or refuse. They followed. The oldest climbed onto the wagon first. The middle girl lifted the youngest by the elbow to help her up. Harlan took the driver's seat, gathered the reins, and kept his voice low when he spoke to the horse, giving the girls time to settle before the wagon began to move. The wheels rattled across the yard. No one stopped them. No one tried to reclaim the girls. The auction noise faded behind them, replaced by the steady creak of wood and the soft sound of wind brushing across their path. Harlan didn't look back at the trading post. He didn't need to. Something inside him had already shifted. What started as a supply trip had turned into a responsibility he hadn't expected but couldn't ignore. 3 girls sat behind him, frightened, exhausted, and waiting to see what kind of man he really was. As the wagon rolled toward the open plains and the long road home, Harlan Boone knew only one thing with absolute certainty. Returning to his quiet life alone was no longer possible. The decision had been made the moment he saw their faces. A new chapter of his life had begun, and turning back wasn't an option. The sky had shifted to a pale orange by the time Harlan Boone guided the wagon off the main trail and toward the narrow path leading to his land. The air cooled quickly with every mile they moved away from town, and the girls sat close together in the back, their shoulders pressed tightly as if any space between them felt unsafe. None of them spoke. None of them tried to climb down. They watched the changing landscape with guarded attention, unsure whether they were being taken somewhere safe or simply to another place of uncertainty. Harlan kept his eyes forward, hands steady on the reins. He could feel their fear without looking, and the weight of it pressed against him in a way he hadn't expected. His original mission for the day, buy supplies and return home, had shifted into something far more complicated. He hadn't planned for visitors. He hadn't prepared a room. He hadn't used the spare cot in years. But he also knew there was no turning them away now. A faint breeze carried the dry smell of sage as they reached the ridge above his homestead. From there, the land stretched wide in every direction. A small corral with 2 horses grazing, a smokehouse built from salvaged lumber, and a one-room cabin set against the gentle slope of a canyon wall. The property looked modest and worn, but it was quiet, and quiet meant safety. Harlan pulled the wagon to a stop near the porch and glanced back at the girls. Their expressions tensed even more now that they faced an unknown place. The oldest girl studied the cabin with sharp, calculating eyes. The middle one scanned every corner of the yard as though expecting someone to jump out of hiding. The youngest stared at the ground, her hands gripping the side rail of the wagon. "You can get down," Harlan said, keeping his tone steady and controlled. The oldest girl moved first. She dropped lightly to the ground, landing with practiced caution. The middle followed, staying close enough that their arms brushed. The youngest hesitated, then climbed down slowly, her legs shaking from exhaustion and nerves. Harlan stepped aside as they approached the porch. He unlocked the cabin door and stood back so they could enter without feeling cornered. The girls exchanged uncertain glances before stepping inside one at a time. The interior smelled of wood smoke and dry cedar. A small stove sat near the corner with a stack of chopped logs beside it. The bed was neatly made, though clearly used often. A table with 2 chairs stood under the only window, and the spare room, more of a storage space, held a folded cot, tools, and a few crates of dried goods. The girls paused just past the doorway. They didn't touch anything. They didn't move farther than necessary. They stayed, bunched together, waiting for his next action with stiff posture. Harlan cleared his throat once, feeling oddly self-conscious in his own home. "You can stay in there," he said, nodding toward the spare room. "Door doesn't lock. Use it how you want." The oldest girl's eyes flicked toward the shed outside, as if checking his intentions. He caught the meaning. "I'll sleep out there tonight," he added. "Gives you space." A subtle shift crossed their faces, small, almost unnoticeable changes in their posture that showed a sliver of relief, or at least less fear. The youngest stepped toward the stove, drawn to the warmth. Her fingers hovered a moment over the metal door before she pulled back, unsure if she was allowed to use it. "You can sit," Harlan said quietly. "You can rest." She lowered herself onto the edge of the table bench without looking up. Asha, the oldest, finally spoke, her voice steady but tight. "Why help us?" Harlan met her gaze. He didn't look away. "Because leaving you, there wasn't something I could do." She held his stare, searching for lies. She didn't find any, but she didn't relax either. Trust wasn't something she could offer after what she'd endured. Talina, the middle girl, stepped in front of her younger sister as if shielding her from something unseen. The instinct told Harlan more about their past than any words could. He didn't push further. He didn't ask questions. Instead, he walked to the shelf, took down a blanket, and placed it folded on the table. "There's more in the storage room. Take what you need." He stepped back out onto the porch, shutting the door quietly behind him to give them privacy. Outside, the evening air grew colder. Harlan stood beside the porch rail, listening to the faint sounds inside the cabin. The shuffle of feet, the creak of the cot unfolding, the soft clinking of metal as one of them inspected a cup. None of the sounds carried fear anymore, only uncertainty. He let out a long breath, steadying himself. He hadn't planned for any of this, but he also felt something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. Not excitement, not pride, something quieter, something simpler. The knowledge that he had done the right thing. Inside the cabin, the 3 girls arranged the small room with quiet efficiency. Asha checked the window latch to make sure it worked. Talina inspected the crates of food, surprised by the abundance compared to what they had eaten recently. Mira smoothed the blanket across the cot, her movements slow as she tried to keep her hands from trembling. They didn't understand this man yet. They didn't know what he expected or why he'd intervened. But the silence of the homestead felt different from the silence of captivity. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't sharp. It wasn't controlled by fear. It simply existed. And for the first time in many days, the girls allowed themselves to breathe without waiting for someone to shout at them. As night settled across the plains, Harlan lit a lantern in the shed and sat on an overturned crate. His back ached, and exhaustion pulled at his eyes, but his thoughts stayed focused on the girls in the cabin. He wondered what tomorrow would bring, what fears they carried, and what choices they would make now that no one held a rope over them. He didn't expect gratitude. He didn't expect trust. He expected only that they would need time, and he was prepared to give them that. Cold morning air settled over the homestead before the sun had cleared the ridge, and thin streaks of frost lined the porch rail when Harlan Boone stepped out of the shed. His breath rose in small white clouds as he stretched the stiffness from his back. He had slept lightly, waking several times to be sure the girls were still safe inside the cabin, though he never walked closer than the porch. He didn't want them startled by seeing a man outside their door in the darkness. He rubbed the sleep from his eyes and scanned the yard. The horses shifted in the corral, snorting at the cold. A few chickens wandered near the smokehouse, scratching at the ground for anything left from yesterday. Everything in sight looked familiar, unchanged. Yet the place felt different now, not in its structure, but in its purpose. He wasn't the only soul living on this land anymore. He took a slow breath, steadying himself before approaching the cabin door. He wanted to check on the girls, make sure they had heat, make sure they ate, but he also didn't want to intrude. He raised his hand, paused a moment, then knocked softly. Asha opened the door only a few inches. Her eyes were sharper than they'd been the night before, awake, alert, studying him immediately for signs of danger. She didn't look scared. She looked ready. Harlan kept his hands visible. "Morning," he said quietly. "Stove needs more wood. I'll bring some in." Asha nodded and stepped aside, giving him a clear path without moving any closer than necessary. Inside, Talina sat near the table, repairing a tear in her skirt with thread she'd found in a drawer. Mira knelt by the stove, warming her hands, her hair covering half her face as she glanced up at him only briefly. "Anybody sleep?" Harlan asked, setting an armload of wood down beside the stove. Talina answered first, her voice quiet but steady. "Some." Mira didn't speak, but she reached for a piece of wood and placed it gently into the stove, as if showing she understood how the cabin worked and wanted to help. Harlan watched them a moment, taking in every subtle detail. How Asha stayed close to her sisters, how Talina's eyes flicked toward the door as if memorizing exit points, how Mira positioned herself near warmth but far from loud noise. He sensed their exhaustion in the way they moved and their uncertainty in how they interacted with the space around them. They weren't familiar with safety yet. It would take time. "I'm fixing breakfast outside," Harlan said. "When it's ready, you can eat at the table. If you want space, I can stay out while you do." Asha studied him again. She wasn't checking for lies. She was checking for patterns, habits, anything that hinted at what kind of man she was dealing with. He stayed still, letting her assess him. "Thank you," she said finally, the words short and precise. Harlan left them to settle, stepping outside to light the small cooking fire. He cracked eggs into an iron pan, added strips of dried meat, and listened to the quiet inside the cabin. No raised voices, no shuffling of panic, just the sound of slow movement and the soft clink of dishes being arranged. As he cooked, Mira slipped outside. She didn't approach him, but she hovered near the horses, drawn again to the animals she'd watched so intently the day before. One of the mares lowered its head toward her, and Mira reached up to touch the bridge of its nose. Her hands shook at first, then steadied as the horse exhaled softly. Harlan watched from the corner of his eye, careful not to interrupt. He knew even small connections could change a person's focus from fear to purpose. And if horses gave the girl something to hold on to, he wouldn't get in the way. Asha came out next, crossing her arms against the cold. She looked over the yard slowly, evaluating every structure the same way a scout would. Harlan realized she wasn't simply cautious. She was deciding if this place could become a real refuge or if it was just another stop in a long run from danger. Talina stepped outside a moment later, rubbing her hands together. She looked less guarded than her sister, but still watched Harlan's movements closely. Breakfast finished, he carried the pan inside and set it on the table before stepping back outside without being asked. He waited near the porch rail, allowing them privacy as they ate. Through the window, he saw the three girls sit close together, sharing food in quiet bites. No arguments, no hesitation. They handled the meal like people who had learned to make the most of whatever they were given. When they finished, Asha opened the door and stood in the doorway, not stepping out yet. "We will help here," she said. "Tell us what work you need done." Harlan shook his head lightly. "Not today. Rest first. Look around. Get your bearings. Tomorrow you can choose what you want to do." Talina exchanged a look with Asha, confused by the idea of choosing their tasks. Mira stepped behind them, keeping close but listening. Asha lowered her chin slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement. "All right," she said. As the morning stretched on, each girl explored a different corner of the homestead at her own pace. Talina inspected the smokehouse, running her fingers across the wooden beams. Mira tended to the horses again, whispering to them under her breath. Asha walked the perimeter of the fence line, studying the boundaries of their new world and making sure there were no threats nearby. Harlan didn't interrupt any of them. He repaired a loose gate latch, stacked chopped wood under the porch, and watched them from a distance, noticing how each movement revealed something new about who they were. Asha was the protector, Talina the thinker, Mira the quiet soul who needed gentleness more than anything. For the first time in many years, the homestead wasn't silent. For the first time in a decade, Harlan Boone wasn't alone. And he felt something shift, small but unmistakable, deep in the quiet part of his chest where he kept everything he didn't talk about. He didn't understand it yet, but he knew their arrival had changed the rhythm of this land forever. By noon, a fragile sense of calm had settled over the place. Not trust, not comfort, but the first thin layer of stability. A beginning. By the fourth morning, the homestead had begun to move with a different kind of rhythm. Tentative, careful, but steadier than the days before. The cold air settled evenly across the yard, carrying the scent of dry earth and the faint smoke drifting from the cabin chimney. Harlan Boone stepped outside at first light, tightening his coat around his shoulders as he walked toward the woodpile. He had always started his days alone, relying on familiar tasks to anchor his thoughts, but the quiet behind him was no longer empty. It carried the soft sounds of people adjusting to a strange place, waking slowly, trying to understand where they now lived. Inside the cabin, Asha was already awake. She stood beside the stove, feeding small pieces of wood into the fire with deliberate care. She moved with an alert steadiness, as if she was making sure every corner of the room stayed in view. Her sister still slept on the cot in the small side room, the blanket pulled tightly around them. Asha took a moment to watch them, her jaw set, her expression both protective and weary. She had barely slept herself, checking the door twice during the night, even though she knew Harlan was outside in the shed. Harlan returned with an armful of firewood and stopped at the doorway. "You're up early," he said, setting the logs near the stove. "I'm used to it," Asha replied. Her voice stayed low, but not hostile. She wasn't ready to relax around him, yet she no longer looked like she expected an attack at any moment. He nodded, not pushing for conversation. As he stepped back outside, Talina emerged from the side room. She blinked unevenly at the sunlight spilling through the doorway, her hair tied back quickly and her expression showing the lingering heaviness of exhaustion. Mira followed her closely, still quiet, her fingers brushing the edge of the wall as if grounding herself in something solid. "Horses need feeding," Harlan said gently, gesturing toward the corral. Myra's eyes lifted at the mention of the animals. She took a hesitant step forward, waiting to see if she was truly allowed. "You can go," Harlan added. She moved instantly, almost relieved to have a task she understood. Talina watched her go, then crossed to the table and began sorting the few cooking utensils she'd used the night before. It wasn't busy work. It was her way of making sense of the new environment. Harlan noticed how each girl fell into a natural role without being asked. Asha gravitated toward the fire and the structure of the cabin, as though maintaining warmth meant maintaining control. Talina smoothed the edges of the domestic space, aligning objects and organizing small tasks. Mira found comfort in motion, especially with animals that didn't speak or threaten or judge. After setting up feed for the chickens, Harlan returned to the barn to check a loose plank in the stall wall. As he lifted the hammer, he sensed movement behind him and turned to find Talina holding a small bucket of nails. She didn't speak at first, waiting to see if her help was welcome. "You can hand me the shorter ones," he said, pointing with the hammer. She stepped closer, still keeping a measured distance, and passed him the nails. Their movements fell into a steady pace, lift, hammer, adjust, until the plank sat flush against the frame. Talina studied the repaired wall with a focused expression, the kind that came from years of needing to understand how things could be taken apart or made secure. "You've done this before," Harlan said. "Sometimes," she replied. "Different places. Not like this." He didn't ask what she meant. She didn't want to relive it, and he had no desire to drag her back into memories that already weighed on her. Outside, Myra's soft voice hummed beside the horses. Asha walked the perimeter of the homestead again, this time checking the fence posts more thoroughly. She tested each rail, pressing her weight gently against them. Harlan realized she wasn't only evaluating their strength. She was determining whether this land could keep dangers out. By midday, the sun warmed the soil enough for the girls to shed the stiffness from their bodies. They gathered around the yard, forming a loose circle of quiet work. Talina swept dirt away from the cabin threshold. Mira brushed the mares until their coats gleamed in the sunlight. Asha carried buckets of water from the well, her steps steady and sure. Harlan repaired a cracked water trough, watching them from the corner of his vision, not supervising, not commanding, observing how naturally they adapted. None of them waited for orders. None of them asked permission for small tasks. They simply worked because it made the unfamiliar less threatening. Later, when the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the ground, Harlan brought out a small sack of potatoes and set them on the table. "I'll cook tonight," he said. Asha raised an eyebrow, not expecting the offer. "You don't have to." "I know," he replied, "but I will." Talina quietly set 3 cups beside the stove. Mira sat at the edge of the bench, her posture relaxed for the first time since she arrived. The meal was simple: boiled potatoes, salted meat, and warm tea. But the atmosphere inside the cabin felt subtly different. The tension in the girls' shoulders eased, the silence no longer sharp but settling. They weren't smiling, not yet, but the rigid caution had softened around the edges. After dinner, Mira gathered the plates without being asked. Talina dried them carefully, stacking each in a neat line. Asha watched her sisters, realizing they were beginning to feel the shape of a routine, something resembling normalcy, something that didn't involve running. As night settled in, Harlan stepped toward the door. "I'll be in the shed again," he said. "If you need anything, you can knock. You won't bother me." Asha hesitated for only a second. "We will." He left them with the same quiet step he always used, and the door closed behind him with a soft thud. Not a threatening sound, not a warning, just a simple end to the day. Inside the cabin, the 3 girls sat close together on the cot. They didn't talk much, but they exchanged small glances, acknowledging a day that felt strange, safe, unfamiliar, and promising all at once. The homestead had not become home yet, but it had become the first place in a long time where danger didn't sit in every shadow. And that alone made the night easier to bear. The 5th morning opened with a heavier chill than the days before, the kind that clung to the ground and made the soil feel firm underfoot. Harlan Boone stepped onto the porch with a tin cup of hot coffee, stretching the stiffness from his shoulders as the pale sky brightened over the ridge. He scanned the yard out of habit, expecting to see everything in its usual order, but something unfamiliar caught his attention. Talina was kneeling near the smokehouse, rearranging firewood that had toppled over during the night. She worked with silent focus, stacking each piece carefully, ensuring nothing tipped again. Her posture held a quiet determination, not from obligation, but from purpose. Harlan noticed immediately that she wasn't doing it for approval. She was doing it because she wanted to contribute something tangible. Before he could greet her, a soft, rhythmic brushing came from the corral. Mira was already with the horses, running a comb through the darker mare's mane. The animal stood completely still, more relaxed than Harlan had ever seen her around strangers. Mira whispered something inaudible, her voice barely above a breath, but whatever she said calmed the mare instantly. It struck him that the girl, despite her fear, carried a natural understanding of animals that couldn't be taught. Asha appeared last, carrying 2 buckets from the well. Her steps were steady, though he could see the strain in her arms. Harlan set his cup on the porch rail and moved toward her. "I can take one," he said quietly. "I've got them," she replied, adjusting the grip on the handles. He didn't insist, but he walked beside her to the cabin anyway. The buckets thudded onto the porch with a controlled drop, and Asha exhaled slowly. She hadn't asked for help, but she hadn't pushed him away either. It was the first time she allowed him to stand that close without shifting her stance defensively. Inside the cabin, Talina placed a pot on the stove. She added dried herbs from a small pouch she'd kept hidden until now. Her own supply, carried with her through hardship, protected from every danger they'd faced. The faint smell filled the cabin, warm and grounding. "You don't have to use your things," Harlan said as he stepped inside. "They'll go bad if I don't," she replied, stirring the mixture. "Better used than wasted." Her tone wasn't blunt or defensive. It was simply honest. Asha entered behind him, wiping her hands on her skirt. "We'll need more water soon," she said. "The well's deep, and Mira can't lift the bucket alone." "I'll handle that," Harlan answered. She nodded once, accepting the division of labor. Breakfast came together without planning. Talina stirred the pot. Mira carried cups to the table, and Asha sliced dried meat with a small knife she'd sharpened the night before. They moved around each other with quiet precision, not yet comfortable, but no longer uncertain about their roles in the shared space. As they ate, sunlight drifted through the window and stretched across the table. Harlan noticed Mira sitting closer than before, a small but significant shift in her comfort. Talina asked a practical question about the layout of the homestead, where the storage crates were kept, how far the nearest town was, whether traders passed nearby. Asha listened carefully to every answer, absorbing details, mapping the area in her mind. "You don't get many visitors?" she asked. "No," Harlan replied. "People stay to the main road. This place is far enough off it that nobody stops unless they're lost." Asha seemed to take relief in that. She didn't say it aloud, but he saw it in the way her shoulders loosened. When the meal ended, something unexpected happened. Mira stood and carried her empty cup to the basin. She paused, glanced at Harlan, and then began washing it with slow, careful motions. Talina joined her without comment, drying the cup with a cloth, then placing it neatly on the shelf. Asha stayed at the table, watching her sisters with a look that mixed exhaustion, pride, and cautious hope. Harlan felt something shift in the room. It wasn't trust yet, not fully, but it was the beginning of shared responsibility, the early formation of a household where people took action because they wanted to care for the space they lived in. He stepped outside to give them room to settle into the moment. By mid-morning, the homestead hummed with quiet activity. Harlan repaired the hinge on the cabin door, noticing how Asha positioned herself nearby. Not close, but close enough to observe his work and understand how the door operated. She asked questions about the tools he used, the type of nails needed, and the reason the hinge had loosened in the first place. Talina swept dust from the porch, working in even strokes that made the old boards look refreshed. She didn't avoid Harlan now. When he passed by with the toolbox, she stepped aside with a small nod. Mira wandered to the pasture fence and sat on the lowest rail, humming under her breath again while the horses grazed. One mare walked directly to her, nudging her shoulder gently. The girl smiled for the first time since arriving, small, brief, but unmistakably real. Asha noticed it from a porch. Her expression softened, and she let the sight settle something inside her that had been wound too tight for too long. Later in the afternoon, Harlan heard a muffled thud from the shed. He stepped inside to find Asha lifting a heavy sack of grain onto the workbench. She winced at the weight, though she tried to hide it. "You'll strain your back if you lift it like that," he said. She set the sack down and straightened. "We've carried heavier." "I believe you," he answered, "but you don't have to now. There's no rush." She studied him again, the same careful evaluation she'd given him since the trading yard. But this time, the suspicion wasn't as sharp. Her jaw eased as she stepped back from the bench. "You can show me the better way," she said. It was the first request she'd made. Harlan demonstrated how to brace the sack against the bench before lifting, using the legs instead of the back. Asha watched closely, then repeated the motion with more control. She didn't thank him aloud, but the slight incline of her head said enough. By evening, the cabin held an atmosphere neither fragile nor tense, simply lived in. The girls sat together on the cot, their posture more relaxed, talking quietly in a language Harlan didn't understand. He didn't try to listen in. He gave them privacy, stepping outside to check the sky while the sun disappeared behind the ridge. He noticed something as he stood there, something small but unmistakable. The girls had left the cabin door open a crack. Not locked, not barred, not closed against him, just open. A sign they didn't feel the need to guard themselves quite as fiercely tonight. Harlan took a long, steady breath and felt a warmth he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. A sense that maybe, after a decade of silence and loss, his home was beginning to grow into something more than a place to sleep. It might, in time, become a place of belonging for all four of them. By the sixth day, the wind carried the smell of distant rain, and thin clouds drifted across the sky like slow-moving sheets. The air was warmer than usual, though charged with the kind of tension that came before a storm. Harlan Boone stepped out of the shed and wiped his hands on a rag, planning to reinforce the fencing along the south edge of the property. The rails had loosened over the winter, and he wanted them secured before bad weather rolled in. He had barely taken 10 steps toward the pasture when he spotted Asha walking across the yard, one hand pressed against her ribs. Her movements were controlled, but there was a rigidity in her posture that made Harlan stop immediately. Asha rarely showed discomfort. She hid pain the way a soldier hid weakness, so the small gestures that others wouldn't notice stood out clearly to him. "What happened?" Harlan asked, not approaching too fast. Asha kept her eyes steady on him, but tension tightened her jaw. "Nothing serious." Talina, who was sweeping near the porch, turned sharply at her sister's voice. She set the broom aside and moved toward Asha with quick, anxious steps. "You didn't tell me," she said quietly, but her tone carried worry rather than anger. Asha waved her off. "I'm fine." Harlan stepped closer, still keeping space. "Let me look." Asha hesitated, torn between pride and practicality. She lowered her hand slowly, revealing a deep purple bruise spreading along the side of her ribs. The mark looked painful even without touching it. Talina inhaled sharply. Mira froze near the corral, and the entire yard fell into a tense silence. "How long has it been like that?" Harlan asked. "Since yesterday," Asha answered. "I lifted the water bucket wrong. The weight caught me off guard." Harlan motioned toward the porch. "Sit down." Asha stiffened. "I don't. It'll heal better if it's wrapped," he said, keeping his voice low, calm, and firm, not commanding, but refusing to ignore the injury. "You don't have to like it, but you should let me help." The conflict on her face was immediate. She wasn't used to being tended to, and she certainly wasn't used to trusting a stranger with anything vulnerable. But the pain was real, and her sister's eyes were on her. After a long moment, she nodded once and sat on the porch step. Talina knelt beside her, protective as always. Mira walked closer, gripping the edge of her skirt, worry etched across her face. Harlan fetched clean cloth and a small jar of salve from the shelf inside the cabin. He returned slowly, careful not to create the impression of closing in. He knelt beside Asha, his movements measured and respectful. "I need to wrap around the ribs," he said. "Tell me if it hurts too much." Asha lifted her arm with a controlled breath. The bruise darkened under the shifting light. Talina watched every motion he made, ready to intervene if anything felt wrong. Harlan applied the salve with the back of his fingers, using the lightest pressure possible. Asha winced once, but she didn't pull away. He wrapped the cloth snugly, but not tightly, ensuring she could breathe comfortably while keeping the muscles supported. "You should rest today," he said. Asha exhaled, the first sign that the pain had eased. "I can still work." "Not today," Harlan answered gently. "You've done enough." She didn't argue this time. Talina touched her sister's arm. "You should have said something." "It's nothing," Asha murmured. Harlan recognized the tone instantly. It was the same thing he used to say whenever someone asked about his old wounds, the same way he hid anything that risked slowing him down. He didn't call her out for it. He simply stood and gave her space. The dynamic inside the cabin shifted after that moment. Asha lay on the cot for the first time during the day, letting her ribs rest. Talina kept checking on her, bringing her water, adjusting the blanket, whispering reassurances that Asha pretended not to need. Mira sat nearby, filing a small piece of which she found into the shape of an animal, something she'd started doing to calm herself. Harlan chopped vegetables for supper, glancing toward the side room every so often. He wasn't worried about the injury. It would heal, but he noticed something important. Asha had accepted help, not begrudgingly, but out of necessity and trust. A fragile trust, but trust nonetheless. Later in the afternoon, Asha stepped out of the cabin, walking slower than usual. Harlan was repairing the latch on the chicken coop when she approached. "You didn't have to do that," she said. Her voice was steady but softer. "You were hurt," he replied. It wasn't right to ignore it. She crossed her arms, careful to avoid pressure on her ribs. We're not used to someone helping with nothing in return. I'm not asking for anything, he said simply. She studied him again, the same deep, assessing stare she'd given him on the first day. But this time, her eyes weren't searching for danger. They were searching for understanding. We will work, she said. We won't be a burden. None of you are. Asha looked away, overwhelmed by the unfamiliar idea. As evening approached, rain clouds darkened the sky. A low rumble echoed across the canyon. Mira stood on the porch, watching the first drops hit the ground. Talina closed the shutters on the cabin window. Asha sat near the table, her posture more relaxed than any previous night. Harlan lit the lantern. The warm glow filled the room, revealing a scene he never imagined would exist under his roof. 3 women recovering, adjusting, learning how to breathe without fear. The storm outside built in quiet waves of thunder. Inside, something steadier grew between them, the early foundation of mutual care. Not spoken, not promised, but lived. Asha leaned back against the chair, her breathing even. Talina handed her a cup of warm broth she'd made herself. Mira rested beside the horses until the rain grew heavy, then rushed inside, dripping with cold water, but smiling in a shy, fleeting way that caught Harlan by surprise. The day had started with pain. It ended with the first real hint of comfort. Not safety, comfort. A subtle difference, but an important one. For the first time since he brought them home, Harlan saw the possibility of a future that included all of them. Not by force, not by obligation, by the slow, deliberate growth of trust built through actions, not words. And as the storm settled into a steady downpour, every person under that roof felt the same quiet truth. This place was no longer temporary. The rain from the night before left the ground cold and dark, and thin puddles formed along the path leading to the barn. Morning light pushed slowly across the horizon, revealing a sky washed clean of dust. Harlan Boone stepped out of the shed and paused on the porch, listening. The homestead was quiet, but not with the silence of isolation. This was different. It was the quiet of people beginning their day with caution, routine, and thought. Inside the cabin, Asha was already awake, sitting at the table with one hand resting near her wrapped ribs. She breathed more evenly than yesterday, though she still shifted carefully to avoid strain. Talina sliced dried fruit into a small bowl. Mira sat cross-legged on the floor, tying a piece of string around a carved wooden shape she'd made during the storm. A small horse with a smooth, rounded head. Harlan tapped lightly on the doorframe before entering. "How's the pain?" he asked. "Less than yesterday," Asha replied, keeping her voice steady. "I can move without trouble." Talina shot her a skeptical glance. She should rest another day. Asha didn't argue, but her jaw tightened the way it always did when someone tried to protect her. Harlan nodded. "You can stay near the cabin. No heavy lifting." Asha accepted the compromise with a slow exhale, showing she understood the practicality, not weakness, in avoiding further injury. As they prepared a simple breakfast, the atmosphere inside the room shifted subtly. There was less tension in the girl's shoulders, fewer glances toward the door. They moved around the space with an ease they hadn't shown earlier in the week. The small routines of survival, boiling water, slicing food, tending the stove, had started to belong to them. After they finished eating, Asha stood and faced Harlan directly. Something in her expression was different, focused, deliberate, measured. Talina and Mira seemed to sense the change as well, falling silent. "We need to talk," Asha said. Harlan set his cup down. "All right." She looked toward the window before speaking again, gathering her thoughts with care. "The men who took us, they didn't intend to keep us. They move from place to place, selling people they capture. They travel fast. They don't return. We know their habits." Harlan's posture tightened slightly. "They won't come here." "No," she answered firmly. "They move east after every raid. They'll pass near other towns, not here." Talina nodded, supporting her sister's words. Mira lowered her gaze, but she listened closely. Harlan absorbed the information quietly. It wasn't relief he felt, just a confirmation he had hoped for. Good, he said. You don't have to worry about them. Asha didn't respond right away. She stepped closer to the table, her eyes never leaving his. We know we are safe from them, but that's not the only reason we stayed. The statement held weight, and Harlan felt the shift in the air immediately. Talina stood still, hands clasped tightly in front of her. Mira moved a fraction closer to Asha, as if seeking reassurance before anything else was said. Asha continued, her voice low but unwavering. We have nowhere else to go. No camp waiting for us. No relatives who survived the last attacks. We've been running for a long time. Longer than we want to admit. She paused, her jaw locking briefly as emotion threatened to break through her control. We could leave if we had reason, she went on. But we don't. Leaving means starting over again. Hiding. Searching for shelter. Trying to trust people who might hurt us. She looked at Harlan with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. Here, no one has hurt us. Here, nothing is demanded. Here, we breathe without waiting for punishment. Talina spoke next, her voice almost a whisper. We don't feel like captives. Mira nodded, clutching the wooden carving in her hands. Asha drew in a slow breath. So we choose to stay. The room went completely still. Harlan didn't move. He didn't take a step toward them. He simply listened, letting the weight of their words settle. He felt pressure rise in his chest. Not anxiety, not fear, but something unfamiliar and steady, something that felt like responsibility merging with acceptance. You're welcome here, he said. Not because I expect something, because you deserve somewhere to rest without looking over your shoulder. Asha studied him again, but the distrust that once shadowed her eyes was gone. In its place was a calm acknowledgement of his sincerity. There's one more thing, she added. We won't stay as guests. We will work. We will build. We will earn our place. You already are, Harlan answered. Silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It carried relief, real, tangible relief, like something heavy had been set down after too many miles of carrying it. Talina exhaled softly, her shoulders lowering. Mira moved closer to the table, almost leaning against it. Asha relaxed her stance, the first true sign that she no longer viewed this cabin as temporary. The rest of the day reflected their decision. Talina organized the shelves inside the cabin, sorting supplies into separate crates. Mira cleaned out the horse trough with careful, patient movements. Asha stayed near the porch, respected her injury, but directing her attention outward, watching the land, learning its boundaries, memorizing its layout so she could understand how to protect it. Harlan repaired a broken latch on the smokehouse door. As he hammered the final nail into place, he felt a quiet steadiness settle into him. He had lived in silence for years, believing solitude was the safest path. But now, the land felt fuller. The cabin no longer echoed with emptiness. The yard carried the sound of human presence. A broom sliding across wood, Mira humming with the horses, Asha giving instructions in her native language to her sisters. These weren't distractions. They were signals of life, signals of people choosing to remain. That evening, when the sun dipped behind the canyon, Harlan lit the lantern on the table. The girls sat together, closer than usual. Talina rested her hands on the wooden carving Mira had finished. Asha watched the flames in the stove as though grounding herself in the steady glow. Mira leaned against Talina's shoulder, tired but calm. Harlan stood by the window for a moment, taking in the scene with a quiet, thoughtful breath. They hadn't asked for protection. They hadn't begged for a place. They hadn't clung to him out of fear. They had chosen to be here. For the first time in many years, Harlan felt something he wasn't sure he even recognized anymore. A future that wasn't just one man moving through empty days, but four people building something together, step by careful step. And tonight was the first night none of them wondered if the morning would take that away. 2 more days passed without incident, and the atmosphere around the homestead shifted in ways none of them had expected. The tension that once clung to every movement began to ease, replaced by quiet patterns of cooperation that formed not from obligation, but from choice. The air was warmer that morning, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant juniper, and the light came across the canyon wall in long, steady lines. Harlan Boone woke early, as he always did, but something felt different when he stepped out of the shed. The homestead didn't feel hollow the way it used to. There was motion, subtle, soft, but unmistakably human. Talina was kneeling beside the garden patch, pulling up stubborn weeds with careful, methodical movements. The space had been neglected for months, but she had taken it upon herself to restore it. She pushed loose soil aside with the edge of her palm, testing its texture, judging how dry it had become. She worked silently, not seeking praise, simply contributing in the way she knew best. Mira stood at the fence a few yards away, brushing the Palomino mare's flank. The horse leaned into her touch, fully at ease. Mira spoke to the animal in short breaths, the words too quiet to hear, but her tone steady enough to calm even the skittish gelding that usually avoided strangers. Her presence near the animals had become a kind of anchor for all of them, proof that gentleness could return even after fear had taken so much. Asha was the last to appear. She stepped onto the porch wearing a clean shirt Talina had mended for her. Her ribs had improved, and she carried herself with stronger posture today. She scanned the horizon briefly before turning her attention toward the cabin walls, checking for cracks or loose boards. Repairing things had become her way of showing commitment to the home she chose. Harlan approached with a bucket of nails and placed it near the porch. "Planning to fix something?" he asked. Asha nodded at the east wall. "The corner seam is splitting. I can reinforce it." He studied her expression. She wasn't asking permission. She was informing him. Assertive, confident, equal. That change mattered more than any repairs. "You can use my tools," he said. "Everything's in the shed." She gave a short nod, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than thanks, then walked toward the shed with measured, determined steps. As the morning settled in, the four of them moved through the yard in a rhythm that felt natural. No one issued orders. No one deferred out of fear. Their tasks overlapped, weaving together into the first true picture of a shared life. Harlan repaired the chicken coop, while Mira sorted feed into smaller baskets, arranging them neatly for easier use. Talina carried fresh water to the cabin, occasionally glancing at Harlan to confirm she understood his hand signals when he pointed toward the pump. Asha sanded the rough portion of the cabin wall where moisture had loosened the boards, checking the edges with her fingertips to ensure the surface was smooth. Every action introduced a new layer of connection. By midday, Harlan prepared lunch on the outdoor stove. He sliced potatoes, added herbs Talina had salvaged, and cooked the mixture slowly. Mira drifted toward the smell, drawn by curiosity more than hunger. She stood a few feet away, watching the pan sizzle, her hands clasped lightly in front of her. "You hungry?" Harlan asked. She nodded once. He handed her a tin cup of warm broth before she asked. She accepted it carefully, as if it were something fragile. When she tasted it, she didn't speak, but her shoulders relaxed. It was the first meal she ate outside the cabin since arriving. Asha approached next, wiping dust from her hands. She glanced at Mira, then at the pot, then at Harlan. "You're cooking again?" she asked. "Someone has to," he answered lightly. Her expression softened, not quite a smile, but a shift in the tension around her eyes. "It smells better than last time." Talina joined them shortly after, carrying a basket of dried corn she had organized earlier. She sat on the table with practiced care and took a seat. The wind brushed across the yard just then, carrying warmth instead of cold. They ate together in silence, but not the uneasy kind. The quiet now had texture, a sense of belonging, a shared purpose, a mutual respect that didn't need to be voiced. Later in the afternoon, something small but important happened. Talina approached Harlan with a folded strip of leather in her hands. "For your wrist," she said, holding it out without hesitation. He took it, unsure what to expect. She had added stitching around the edges, creating support for when he lifted heavy boards or tools. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't decorative. It was meant to help him work with less strain. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "I know," Talina replied. "But I wanted to." Asha watched the exchange from a distance, recognizing what it meant. Not gratitude to a rescuer, but an offering of partnership. Mira nodded quietly beside her, as if she understood the significance even more clearly. Harlan tied the leather around his wrist, testing the fit. It felt secure, useful, thoughtful. "You did good work," he said. Talina's cheeks warmed slightly, though she kept her expression neutral. As evening settled, Asha returned from the far edge of the property and approached Harlan near the porch. Her voice was calmer than he had ever heard it. "You should know something," she said. "When we first arrived, we stayed because we had no choice. Now we stay because this place feels different from any place we've been." She looked toward Talina and Mira, who stood together near the corral, laughing quietly at something the horses did. "They sleep without fear," she continued. "That hasn't happened in a long time." Harlan nodded. "I'm glad you're finding peace." Asha studied him closely. "You're a quiet man, but you're steady. That matters." He met her gaze, understanding the weight behind her words. She wasn't praising him. She was admitting trust, carefully, intentionally, fully aware of the vulnerability it carried. "We'll keep building this place," she said. "All of us." And for the first time since the girls arrived, Harlan felt something solid form beneath the surface of their interactions. Not obligation, not dependency, devotion, expressed through small, genuine acts that stitched their lives together a little more each day. That night, the four of them sat inside the cabin while the lantern flickered softly against the walls. Asha rested her ribs quietly. Talina organized her newly cleaned tools. Mira carved a tiny wooden bird beside the stove. Harlan leaned against the doorframe, watching the calm scene unfold. No one said it aloud, but the truth was clear. The homestead was no longer a shelter. It was becoming a real home, built not from walls or roofs, but from consistent care, earned trust, and a growing bond none of them fully expected. And tomorrow, that bond would deepen even further. The ninth morning rose calm and mild, the sky stretching in a soft gradient of gold and pale blue. The storm had passed, leaving the land washed clean, and the familiar smell of damp soil drifted across the homestead. Harlan Boone stepped onto the porch, rubbing the back of his neck as he surveyed the yard. The fence stood solid, the barn roof held firm, and the cabin windows reflected steady morning light. It looked like any other day, yet he could feel something different in the stillness. Inside the cabin, the three women moved with a settled rhythm that hadn't existed even a week earlier. Asha tightened the wrap around her ribs, testing her range of motion with slow, deliberate breaths. Talina stirred a pot of cornmeal on the stove, steam rising in soft wisps as she added herbs she had collected near the canyon wall. Mira carved another small figure at the table, a mare with a raised head, shaping the wood with focused concentration. When Harlan entered, all three paused, not from fear but from awareness. They exchanged looks, silent but meaningful. Something was on their minds. Asha set down the cloth she had been adjusting. "We need to speak with you," she said, her tone steady. Harlan pulled out the chair opposite them. "All right." Talina glanced at Asha, encouraging her to begin. Mira folded her hands tightly around the carving in her lap. Asha squared her shoulders. "We've been here long enough to understand the truth of this place. You live with honesty. You give space. You don't take advantage." She paused, letting each word carry its full weight. "We feel safe here." Harlan didn't interrupt. Talina continued next. "We feel like we belong. Not because we were rescued, because we choose to stay." Mira nodded firmly, her eyes more confident than he had ever seen them. Asha stepped forward, placing her hands on the table. "We don't want to remain as guests. That feels temporary. We want this to be our home, fully." Harlan's breath deepened. He had expected gratitude, maybe a decision to remain a while longer, but not this direct declaration. "This is your home if you want it," he said quietly. Asha shook her head slightly. "We mean something more." Talina clasped her hands. "We want permanence." Mira lifted the carved horse she had been holding and set it in front of Harlan, gently but with intent. It wasn't a gift. It was a sign, a statement, a promise. Asha continued, her voice firm but warm. "If you would allow it, we want to join our lives with yours. Not out of obligation, not out of fear. We want to build this home as one family. The words struck him with unexpected force. He felt his heartbeat steady in a way he didn't anticipate. For 10 years, he had lived under the shadow of loss, believing there was no path back toward connection. Yet here were 3 women, strong, wounded, resilient, asking him to stand beside them as something more than a protector. He looked at each of them in turn. Asha with her unwavering leadership, Talina with her quiet intelligence, Mira with her gentleness that softened even the hardest moments. He felt an emotion rise that he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge in years. Possibility. If this is what you want, he said slowly, then I'll stand with you. Asha exhaled in a steady breath that released weeks of tension. Talina blinked quickly, her eyes brightening with relief. Mira covered her mouth briefly, then lowered her hand and smiled. A small, shy smile that carried enormous meaning. Asha approached him first. Then let us mark this day. They spent the afternoon preparing a simple ceremony of their own making. No preacher, no official papers, just honest words exchanged under the open sky. The same sky that had watched over their shared work, their steady healing, their growing trust. Asha braided a thin strand of leather into her hair. Talina wore a beaded band she'd saved from her past life. Mira tucked a tiny feather behind her ear. They didn't dress up for show. They prepared themselves with symbols that held meaning only to them. Harlan shaved, washed his face, and brushed his coat clean. He looked in a small mirror near the porch and barely recognized the man staring back, a man who was no longer carrying his life alone. They met at the edge of the property where the canyon opened wide. The wind moved across the grass in a slow sweep, gentle enough to be comforting. Asha stood beside him. We pledge to stay with you. Talina clasped his hand. We pledge to work beside you. Mira stepped closer, voice soft but unwavering. We pledge to build a life with you. When they finished, Harlan spoke with a steady tone that made Asha's gaze soften, Talina's shoulders relax, and Myra's breath hitch. I'll protect this home with everything I have. I'll stand with each of you, and I'll never let fear rule this place again. No one cried. No one raised their voice. It wasn't dramatic. It was sincere, grounded, and entirely theirs. They sealed their commitment by setting 3 carved symbols on the porch rail. The horse Mira made, a smooth river stone Asha found near the canyon, and a small woven strip Talina created during the storm. Together, the objects represented their individual strengths and the new life they had chosen. That night, the cabin glowed with lantern light. The fire crackled softly. Asha rested against the wall with a calm expression, no strain in her posture. Talina prepared a cup of tea, mixed with herbs she had collected herself. Mira curled up with a blanket she had claimed as her own. Harlan sat in the chair nearest the door, listening to the quiet breathing around him. This wasn't the silence of loneliness anymore. It was the silence of belonging. A family, formed not through blood or tradition, but through deliberate, mutual choice, sat together under one roof. And for the first time in a decade, Harlan Boone felt his life settle into something whole, steady, and deeply peaceful. The future was no longer empty. It was theirs,